Today, we're going to shift gears, and I want to explore a totally different kind of laugh that you find in Scripture, but I find it a fascinating one and a challenging one, and one that we all need to aspire to laughing more this way. It's the laugh that causes demons to tremble and the foes of God to flee. It's the laugh that goes, ha, take this. If last week was a laugh of disbelief, let's call this one the laugh of fearless confidence. The laugh of courageous faith, the laugh that scoffs at what lies ahead or what might stand against the things of God. Here's a taste of that kind of laugh from the Bible. In Proverbs 31, a woman is described this way. She is clothed with strength and dignity, and she laughs without fear of the future. Now, think about that. To be clothed with such strength, such faith in God that you can laugh at the thought of the future, at whatever the future might hold, and in the total, absolute absence of fear. Let me give you another example from one of the Psalms of the Bible. We don't have the melody, but we know that these were the lyrics to some type of song. It reads, "Why do you boast about your crimes, great warrior? Don't you realize God's justice continues forever? All day long, you plot destruction. Your tongue cuts like a sharp razor. You're an expert at telling lies. You love evil more than good and lies more than truth. You love to destroy others with your words, you liar. But God will strike you down once and for all. He will pull you from your home and uproot you from the land of the living. The righteous will see it, be amazed. They will laugh and say, look what happens to mighty warriors who do not trust in God." So you see the kind of laugh we're talking about here, the laugh of fearless confidence, the laugh that looks at whatever might come down the pike, whatever might be arrayed against the work of God in this world, and they just say to themselves, this is nothing compared to the power of God, and they just laugh in the face of it. The laugh that says, bring it on, you are no match for the living God. And if God calls me to stand against you, you don't have a chance, and I'm not going to cower in fear. So how does that kind of laugh play out? I mean, how does it develop? How does it show itself? What does it really look like in action? Well, we have a great example from the life of the person who wrote the lyrics to that psalm, that song that we just read. In fact, they almost certainly wrote it reflecting on what happened to them when they faced a scoffing, sneering, mocking warrior who was mocking God. Because the writer of that psalm, those lyrics, was David. The David of the famed David and Goliath story. Most of you, whether you are a Christian or not, already know the story, or you know the main parts. A young shepherd boy takes on a giant with a slingshot and a few stones and wins. That much we know. Oh, there's so much more. Let's dig in for what let him laugh at a giant. And even years later, reflecting back on it, he's still remembering the laugh involved. The story is found in the Old Testament book of 1 Samuel. And it begins that the Philistines, it says, gathered their forces for war and assembled. Saul, who was the king of Israel, and the Israelites assembled, and they drew up their battle line to meet the Philistines. The Philistines occupied one hill, and the Israelites another, with the valley between them. Now, make sure you get that picture, because that'll be important later on. You've got two main armies who've come to fight, battle, and they occupy opposing high ground areas, and there is a valley in between. On the one side, the Philistines, who are the bad guys, the adversaries, the aggressors. The other hill are the Israelites, the good guys, the people who acknowledge and worship the one true God. And again, in between, this valley. Okay, let's keep reading. Then Goliath, a Philistine champion, came out of the Philistine ranks to face the forces of Israel. He was over 9 feet tall. He wore a bronze helmet, and his bronze coat of mail weighed 125 pounds. He also wore bronze leg armor. He carried a bronze javelin on his shoulder. The shaft of his spear was as heavy and thick as a weaver's beam, tipped with an iron spearhead that weighed 15 pounds. His armor bearer walked ahead of him carrying a shield. Okay, little background here about what's going on. The ancient Greeks, to whom the Philistines were somewhat related, would often settle their disputes by with another warring party by saying, all right, we're going to put forth our greatest warrior, you put forth your greatest warrior, and we'll agree that whoever wins the collective conflict. Whoever won the war. So if you took the dare, you better win. And oftentimes that's what they do because, the one side had confidence in their warrior and the other side had confidence in theirs. And if you didn't take the dare, then you were showing cowardice or that you had no one who could match up, that you were the weaker of the two parties. Eventually, they might call off the opportunity to match up and just go at it with their full force, but it wasn't uncommon to start off this way and just see what happened. The Philistines found out that by sending Goliath, this could go on for days. There just weren't going to be any takers. And in the meantime, they could just keep fortifying for the fight and maybe even have additional armies trek and join their assembled force. And that's not all. The longer the Philistines kept sending Goliath out, the more the humiliation of the Israelites and, in their minds, the humiliation of the God of Israel, who supposedly was with them, the humiliation could go on, which the Philistines enjoyed immensely. So that's what kept happening day after day. Let me keep reading. Goliath stood and shouted a taunt across to the Israelites. "Why are you all coming out to fight?" he called. "I'm the Philistine champion, but you're only the servants of Saul. So choose one man to come down here and fight me. If he kills me, we'll be your slaves. But if I kill him, you will be our slaves. I defy the armies of Israel today. Send me a man who will fight me." When Saul and the Israelites heard this, they were terrified and deeply shaken. For 40 days, every morning and evening, the Philistine champion strutted in front of the Israelite army. Okay, play that one back. Here's a trained, tested, battle-hardened champion warrior taunting an conscripted army of men who may have been working the fields the week before. And he went out not once, not twice, but for 40 days, twice a day for 40 days, taunting the army of Israel, and Israel had no one to go and take the challenge, or at least no one who would dare. And you can understand why. Goliath, the champion warrior selected by the Philistines, was so intimidating, so awesome in size and power. He's described in detail. 9 feet tall, 125 pounds of armor. But it just wasn't his size or his strength, but his presence. The way he got into their psyche, the way he dominated their emotions, the way he intimidated them with his sheer physical presence. There's no way you would look at Goliath and bust out in the laughter of fearless confidence. Now, let's bring in David. Jesse, who was David's father, sent David to check up on his brothers, and his brothers were part of the Israelite army, and he sent David to check on them and to bring them some food. He was too young to be conscripted, so he had been back home caring for the family sheep. Let's read what happened when he got there. So David left the sheep with another shepherd and set out early the next morning with the gifts, as Jesse had directed him. He arrived at the camp just as the Israelite army was leaving for the battlefield with shouts and battle cries. Soon the Israelite and Philistine forces stood facing each other, army against army. David left his things with the keeper of supplies and hurried out to the ranks to greet his brothers. As he was talking with them, Goliath, the Philistine champion from Gath, came out from the Philistine ranks, and David heard him shout his usual taunt to the army of Israel. And as soon as the Israelite army saw him, they began to run away in fright. Now let's stop there because it tells us that things had gotten a lot worse. Think back to what we read just a minute ago. When Goliath first steps forward, the Bible says that Goliath stood and shouted a taunt across to the Israelites. And then he said, "Choose one man to come down here and fight me." That's how it started. Remember, they were on two hills with a valley in between. Goliath walked out from the Philistine ranks, went down into the valley between the two armies, and shouted up his challenge. But by the time David got there, Goliath wasn't down in the valley shouting up anymore. After 40 days, we read this. As David was talking with them, Goliath, the Philistine champion from Gath, came out from the Philistine ranks. Then David heard him shout his usual taunt to the army of Israel. Now, in the Hebrew language that this was originally written in, that phrase "came out" literally meant coming up. He came out and came up, meaning that he had gotten bolder and bolder, closer and closer, until now he was coming down from his hill, crossing the valley, and starting to go up to their hill. Now, can I hit the pause button there for a minute? Just a life lesson that just don't want to pass by. This is why the laugh of fearless confidence is such an important laugh to cultivate. to nurture, to pursue, to chase after in faith. Because if you react in fear, all it does is going to be inviting that giant, whatever that giant might be, closer, closer, closer. And get more bold, to take up more residence in your life, to have more of a hold on you than before, more of a hold on the world. The only thing you get with facing giants with fear is more of the giant. Fear of giants just leads to a giant invitation. There's only one thing that keeps giants from drawing near. You got to laugh at them. Laugh in the confidence of the power of God. Well, what happened next? Don't worry about this Philistine, David told the Israelite King Saul. I'll go fight him. Don't be ridiculous, Saul replied. There's no way you can fight this Philistine and possibly win. You are only a boy, and he's been a man of war since his youth. And Saul was right, wasn't he? I mean, he was right. I mean, David was too little. He didn't have the resources. He wasn't old enough. Looking at it from a strictly logical, factual way, there was no chance this was going to be certain failure and humiliation. And they couldn't risk losing to Goliath. They had been spending the last 40 days trying to find a way to avoid him and still win the war because they didn't have any giant killers. And again, that's where they were right and also where they were wrong. They were right in their temporal, worldly, human assessment. There was no one in the camp of Israel that could battle Goliath and win. But they were wrong to be thinking only of the men they had in camp as opposed to the God they worshiped. And that's what David saw so clearly and so passionately and so confidently. He knew he couldn't beat Goliath either, but God could. He wasn't a giant killer. He just knew a God who was. So listen to his thinking. But David persisted. I have been taking care of my father's sheep and goats, he said. When a lion or a bear comes to steal a lamb from the flock, I go after it with a club and I rescue the lamb from its mouth. If the animal turns on me, I catch it by the jaw and I club it to death. I have done this to both lions and bears. I'll do it to this pagan Philistine. For he has defied the armies of the living God. The Lord, and this is his thinking, the Lord who rescued me from the claws of the lion and the bear will rescue me from the Philistine. That's an amazing response. David was not thinking about the giant. He was thinking about his God, his past experience with his God. He was remembering how faithful God had been to him time and again, how powerful God had been, how trustworthy, how God had always come through. It wasn't about the size or strength of the giant or his own abilities to fight. It was all about what God could do. But how do you get to that place? The same way David did. If you remember, just like David kind of scrolled back on how God was faithful to him, if you are a Christ follower, go back over your life. Reflect on the times that God has proved himself incredibly faithful, amazingly alive, when he ambushed you with his power. Think of the answers to prayer, the steps of faith. Think of the breakthroughs. Just make a list. I mean, haven't you ever whispered a prayer that just said, thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you? Have you ever looked back on your life, even during the very tough times, and in hindsight, you see the hand of God in ways that you know were beyond gracious, beyond protective? Haven't there been even one time when you took a step of faith that was of such a nature that if God didn't come through, it was going to be a train wreck? And God came through? If you are in any kind of relationship with God, you've got a list. And if you don't, you better take some time to remember it, because that would be shameful not to. So why is it that when we face a new giant, it's like all that stuff never happened? And we suddenly have amnesia, or it doesn't count for anything, or that God's faithfulness, while proven over and over, is now suddenly suspect. Folks, let me tell you something. You can follow whatever it is God wants you to follow, wherever he's calling you to do or to be. You can confront whatever challenge you face that is staring you in the face. You can move forward in life against any fears that you have, no matter what is blocking your way. You can face down any evil, wrongdoing, or injustice. Anything that God is about and calling you to do, to be, to act, to fight, with confidence, courage, boldness, and assurance because of the character and the power of God. Because it's not about you. It's certainly not about the giant. It's about God. Knowing that, believing that, trusting that is what set David's life apart and gave him the most powerful laugh any human can ever produce. And it is the laugh of fearless confidence. I ran across something Max Lucado once wrote about this. He said, if you go back to the David and Goliath story and count how many times David actually mentions the name Goliath against how many times David mentions, the Lord, it comes out 9 times to 2. David mentions God 4 times more than he does the giant. And then Max raises the obvious question. Do you reflect on hope 4 times more than dread? Do you reflect on the strength of God 4 times more than the demands of your day? We don't, do we? But we should. But what happened next? Well, we all know. It's the fun part. So let's read it and have fun. David picked up 5 smooth stones from a stream and put them into his shepherd's bag. Then, armed only with his shepherd's staff and sling, he started across the valley to fight the Philistine. Goliath walked out toward David with his shield bearer ahead of him, sneering in contempt at this ruddy-faced boy. Am I a dog, he roared at David, that you come at me with a stick? And he cursed David by the names of all of his gods. Come over here and I'll give your flesh to the birds and the wild animals, Goliath yelled. David replied to the Philistine, you come to me with sword, spear, javelin. I come to you in the name of the Lord of heaven's armies, the God of the armies of Israel whom you have defied. Today the Lord will conquer you, and I will kill you and cut off your head. And then I will give the dead bodies of your men to the birds and wild animals, and the whole world will know there is a God in Israel. And everyone assembled here will know that the Lord rescues his people, but not with sword and spear. This is the Lord's battle, and he will give you to us. As Goliath moved closer to attack, David quickly ran out to meet him. Reaching into a shepherd's bag, taking out a stone, he hurled it with his sling, hit the Philistine in the forehead. The stone sank in. Goliath stumbled and fell face down on the ground. So David triumphed over the Philistine with only a sling and a stone, for he had no sword. Then David ran over and pulled Goliath's sword from its sheath and used it to kill him and to cut off his head. Now, I know that if we were to just end right there, it's a feel-good story, but I think there'd still be a bunch of you, even with all we've gone through, would still be saying to yourself, oh, that's David. I'm not David. My giants are different than that. I'm not even sure God is on my side. Can I give you 3 truths? Just 3 pastoral truths? First, you're right. You're not David. Neither am I. But you are just as much a prized child of his as David was. Not one bit less. You don't matter one bit less than David. Second, what happened had nothing to do with what kind of person David was. David had a colossal bunch of screw-ups in his life. This is not about what kind of person David was. It had everything to do with what kind of God David, as a person, had fearless confidence in. And the God of David is your God. When you read the Bible and you read these stories and all these exploits and all these amazing things, remind yourself, that's my God. That's the one I pray to. That's the one that knows my name. The God of Abraham is my God. The God of Noah is my God. The God of Solomon, the God of Joshua, the God of Moses, the God of Paul and Timothy and Luke and John. That's my God. And he's going to want to work in my life just as much as he would want to work in theirs, and did. You can laugh the laugh of David because you have the God of David. Which leads to one last little pastoral truth. No matter your giant or what giant you're sensing that you're being called to confront, if that giant is keeping you from becoming who God longs for you to be, if that giant keeps you from doing what God is calling you to do, if that giant is keeping this world from being what it is meant to be, if that giant opposes and defies the living God, you can have complete confidence that God is on your side. And that if you look behind you, he has your back. and you can meet whatever giant with absolute fearless confidence.